What if I told you that Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and every medieval drama you've ever watched are actually pretty tame compared to what really happened in medieval Europe? We're talking about real kings who murdered their own brothers for power, queens who led armies while pregnant, and political schemes so twisted they'd make Cersei Lannister look like an amateur. Today we're diving deep into the most insane political dramas of the medieval period. Stories so wild that HBO writers couldn't make this stuff up. From the anarchy that tore England apart for 19 years, to the bloody rise and fall of the Borgias, to Byzantine emperors who literally had their enemies' eyes gouged out as a political strategy. I'm talking about real people, real power, and real consequences. These weren't fictional characters. These were actual human beings who shaped the course of Western civilization through sheer ruthlessness, brilliant strategy, and sometimes pure luck. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, because we're about to explore the dark, twisted, and absolutely fascinating world of medieval political intrigue. Let's start with what historians call the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war that nearly destroyed England, and it all started because of one stubborn king and one very determined woman. Picture this. It's 1120, and King Henry I of England has a problem. His only legitimate son, William, just died in a shipwreck. Now, medieval inheritance law says the crown should go to the nearest male relative, in this case, Henry's nephew Stephen. But Henry has other ideas. Enter Matilda, Henry's daughter, brilliant, educated, and absolutely ruthless. Henry makes his nobles swear an oath to accept her as his heir. But here's the thing about medieval nobles. Their loyalty lasted about as long as it took them to count their coins. When Henry dies in 1135, Stephen immediately seizes the throne. His reasoning? A woman can't rule England. Matilda's response? Hold my mead and watch me. What follows is 19 years of the most brutal civil war England had ever seen. And I'm not talking about neat, organized battles. This was total warfare. Castles built overnight, towns burned to the ground, and nobles switching sides faster than you could say Game of Thrones. Matilda proved she was every bit as ruthless as any male ruler. When she captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, she didn't just imprison him, she made him watch as she systematically destroyed his supporters' lands. She personally led sieges while pregnant, negotiated ransoms worth king's fortunes, and once escaped from Oxford Castle in the middle of winter by rappelling down the walls in a white cloak to camouflage against the snow. But Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, because medieval naming was apparently very creative, wasn't backing down either. She raised armies, negotiated alliances, and kept the war going even when her husband was captured. For 19 years, England bled. Chronicles from the time describe villages where no one was left alive, fields that went unplanted for decades, and nobles who built castles just to control a single bridge or crossroads. The war finally ended not because anyone won, but because everyone was exhausted. Matilda's son Henry, later Henry II, eventually took the throne, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. The lesson? Never underestimate a medieval woman with a legitimate claim to power and the army to back it up. But if you think English civil wars were bad, wait until you hear about the Borgias, a Spanish family who literally bought their way to the papacy and then used the power of God to commit sins that would make Satan himself blush. Meet Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to America. Except while Columbus was discovering new worlds, Alexander was busy corrupting the old one. First, let's talk about how he became Pope. Rodrigo literally bought the papacy. We're not talking about subtle donations. He straight up bribed cardinals with castles, money, and promises of power. Medieval records show he spent what would be millions of dollars in today's money to secure votes. But the real star of our show is his son, Cesare Borgia, the man who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince and basically invented modern political warfare. Picture Renaissance Italy. Dozens of city-states, each with their own armies, constantly at war with each other. Into this chaos steps Cesare, with the resources of the papacy behind him and absolutely no moral constraints. Cesare's strategy was simple but effective. Diplomacy backed by overwhelming force. He'd show up outside a city with cannons, relatively new technology at the time, and politely ask them to surrender. If they refused, he'd level their walls and then show the next city what happened to people who said no. But it's the family dynamics that really make this story insane. There are credible historical accounts of Cesare murdering his own brother, Giovanni, because they were rivals for their father's favor. We're talking about a papal family where sibling murder was just Tuesday. Then there's Lucrezia Borgia, probably the most misunderstood woman in history. Popular culture paints her as a poisoner and seductress, but the reality is more complex and actually more interesting. Lucrezia was married 3 times by age 21, and each marriage was a political alliance arranged by her father and brother. Her first husband was murdered, probably by Cesare. Her second marriage was annulled when the political situation changed. But here's what's fascinating. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, cultured, and actually pretty decent by Renaissance standards. The Borgias turned the papal court into something that resembled a cross between a Renaissance art salon and a crime family headquarters. They patronized incredible artists. We're talking about people like Pinturicchio and Raphael. But they also hosted orgies in the Vatican and sold church positions to the highest bidder. Their downfall came when Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, possibly poisoned, though probably just from malaria. Without papal protection, Cesare's enemies closed in. Within months, the man who had conquered most of central Italy was in prison. Cesare eventually escaped and died in Spain, fighting as a mercenary. Lucrezia lived quietly as Duchess of Ferrara, patronizing artists and poets until her death in 1519. The Borgia legacy? They proved that in medieval and Renaissance politics, family loyalty, unlimited resources, and complete ruthlessness could take you to the very top, but it couldn't keep you there. Now let's travel east to the Byzantine Empire, where political intrigue wasn't just an art form, it was a survival skill. And nobody practiced it more brutally than Emperor Basil II, known to history as Basil the Bulgar-Slayer. The Byzantine Empire in the year 1000 was the last remnant of the Roman Empire, controlling modern-day Turkey, Greece, and parts of the Balkans. But it was under constant pressure from all sides: Arabs to the south, various Slavic tribes to the north, and most persistently, the Bulgarian Empire. Basil II became emperor in 976 at age 18, and he immediately faced a problem that would define his entire 49-year reign. The Bulgarians refused to stay conquered. For 20 years, Basil fought campaign after campaign against Bulgarian Tsar Samuel. This wasn't genteel medieval warfare with ransoms and courtly prisoners. This was total war, with both sides committing atrocities that shocked even medieval chroniclers. The turning point came at the Battle of Clydion in 1014. Basil's forces surrounded and completely destroyed Samuel's army, capturing an estimated 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. What Basil did next became one of the most infamous acts of medieval warfare. He had all 15,000 prisoners blinded. But here's the detail that makes it even more horrifying. He left one eye to every 100th man so they could lead the others home. Imagine being Tsar Samuel, waiting for your army to return, and instead seeing a procession of 15,000 blinded soldiers stumbling back to your capital. According to Byzantine chronicles, Samuel died of shock 2 days after seeing his men. The psychological impact was exactly what Basil intended. Bulgarian resistance collapsed almost immediately. Word spread throughout the Balkans that this was what happened to people who opposed Byzantium. But here's what makes Basil's story really interesting from a political perspective. This act of brutality actually worked. After Clydion, the Byzantine Empire experienced its last great golden age. Basil expanded the empire's borders further than they'd been since the 7th century. He also completely reformed the Byzantine tax system, breaking the power of the great noble families who had been basically feudal lords. Basil created a class of small farmers who owed their land directly to the emperor, generating massive tax revenues that funded his military campaigns. The man was a brilliant administrator. He personally oversaw the empire's finances, often camping with his armies rather than living in imperial luxury. Contemporary accounts describe him as sleeping on the ground with his soldiers and eating the same rations. What's fascinating is the contrast between Basil's public brutality and his private competence. He never married, dedicating his entire life to governing. He spoke multiple languages, personally negotiated treaties, and according to Arab chroniclers, could discuss theology, philosophy, and military strategy with equal expertise. By his death in 1025, Basil had transformed Byzantium from a declining rump state into the dominant power in southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. The empire's treasury was so full that his successors didn't need to raise taxes for decades. But, and here's the lesson about medieval politics, his success died with him. Because he never married, he had no direct heir. The empire fell into civil war within 20 years of his death, and by 1071, most of his conquests were lost forever. Basil the Bulgar-Slayer proved that in medieval politics, spectacular brutality combined with administrative brilliance could create an empire. But it also showed that personal rule, no matter how successful, couldn't survive the ruler's death. For our final story, let's talk about the most complicated political system in medieval Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, and a succession crisis so twisted it took 23 years to resolve and involved literally every major power in Europe. Our story begins in 1197 with the death of Emperor Henry VI. Now, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't really Roman, wasn't particularly holy, and barely functioned as an empire. It was more like a loose confederation of German kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, all theoretically owing allegiance to an elected emperor. Henry's heir was his 3-year-old son Frederick, but medieval politics and toddler emperors don't mix well, especially when there are ambitious adults with their own claims to power. Enter our two main contestants, Otto IV, backed by England and the Pope, and Philip of Swabia, Henry's brother, backed by France. What followed was a civil war that made the anarchy look like a friendly disagreement. For 12 years, Germany was essentially two separate kingdoms. Otto controlled the north and west, Philip controlled the south and east, and both spent enormous amounts of money buying loyalty from German nobles who switched sides whenever someone offered them a better deal. But here's where it gets really medieval. In 1208, Philip was murdered at his own wedding by a personal enemy who had nothing to do with the succession crisis. He was literally stabbed to death during the wedding feast over a completely separate dispute about a woman. This should have ended the Civil War, right? Wrong. Because now Frederick, still only 14 years old, stepped forward with his own claim, backed by the Pope who had decided he didn't like Otto after all. What happened next was peak medieval politics. Otto was crowned emperor in Rome in 1209, then immediately started a war with the Pope who had just crowned him. Meanwhile, Frederick was also crowned emperor, also in Rome, by a different group of cardinals. So now we have two Holy Roman emperors, both claiming to be the legitimate ruler, both backed by different European powers, and both fighting a war that involved England, France, the papacy, and most of the German nobility. The crisis finally reached a climax at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, one of the most important battles you've probably never heard of. Otto, backed by England and various German allies, faced off against Frederick's ally, King Philip Augustus of France. Otto's coalition was completely destroyed. King John of England lost so much money funding Otto that his own nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta the next year. Otto himself fled the battlefield and spent the rest of his life as a minor German duke. Frederick II finally became undisputed emperor in 1220 at age 26, having spent most of his life fighting for a throne he'd technically inherited as a toddler. And here's the wild part. Frederick turned out to be one of the most remarkable rulers in medieval history. He spoke 9 languages, founded the University of Naples, wrote poetry, conducted scientific experiments, and created a legal code that influenced European law for centuries. He also managed to regain Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than warfare, somehow getting himself crowned king of Jerusalem while simultaneously being excommunicated by the Pope. But the 23-year succession crisis had permanently weakened the Holy Roman Empire. By the time Frederick died in 1250, the empire was so decentralized that it barely functioned as a political unit. Germany wouldn't be truly unified again until 1871. The lesson? Medieval politics was so complex and personal that a single succession dispute could reshape the entire political landscape of Europe for centuries. So there you have it. The real Game of Thrones was actually happening across medieval Europe for centuries. We've seen Matilda and Stephen tear England apart for 19 years over a principle. We've watched the Borgias turn the papacy into a crime family operation. We've witnessed Basil II use psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. And we've followed Frederick II through a 23-year succession crisis that involved half of Europe. What's fascinating is how personal medieval politics was. These weren't abstract policy debates. They were literally life and death struggles between individuals who knew each other personally. When Cesare Borgia murdered his brother, when Basil blinded 15,000 prisoners, when Matilda escaped from Oxford Castle, these were real people making decisions that affected millions of lives. And honestly, when you look at modern politics, you can see echoes of these same patterns. The personal rivalries, the family dynasties, the willingness to do absolutely anything for power, it's all still there, just with different weapons and better PR. What do you think? Are there any medieval political stories you'd like to see covered in future videos? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval political intrigue, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next video, we're diving into medieval economic warfare, how merchants and bankers brought down kingdoms without ever drawing a sword. Trust me, it's just as dramatic as anything we covered today. Thanks for watching, and remember, truth really is stranger than fiction, especially when it comes to medieval politics.